I'm going to switch to a different topic, but very close to what Kurt was talking about, rain gardens in residential settings. Not the street side rain gardens, but these are now up on the landscape, taking the runoff from the roofs and infiltrating those into the soil. And the studies we did in Lincoln, Nebraska on some rain gardens that were installed there a few years ago. We're not 10 years into our rain garden projects like Kurt was talking about with lots of data. The rain gardens I'm going to talk about were installed in 2007, 2008, and they were demonstration projects put in by the city of Lincoln in 20 homeowners or 18 homeowners' yards and 2 commercial sites. Since then, they've gone through and put in over 150 demonstration rain gardens in the city. And we've been working the last few years. My role is as an extension and research specialist at the University of Nebraska in water quality and surface water management. So we've had a 5-year project to promote LID, primarily rain gardens and other green infrastructure for stormwater management around the state. And this study was part of the last few year focus we've had in this area. My colleagues and co-authors are Steve Rohde, who's a landscape architect with the University of Nebraska, and David Shelton, who's in the same department as I am in the Department of Biological Systems Engineering at the University of Nebraska. So as I mentioned, we're talking about bioretention with rain gardens in residential settings. The components that make these are the plant selection, the grading to make these a level basin, and most of you are familiar with this, so I don't need to go into a lot of detail. We intended to have an inlet point and an outlet point designed into these, and these were all built in the native soil of the site with compost amended in the top 6 inches. This photograph shows a typical example. You can see the downspout from the home feeding into the small rain garden. Here are a few examples of what we saw. We went back and we evaluated 12 of the 18 rain gardens after 4 to 5 years of growth. And we did that a few years later so that the plant roots had time to mature. There was some freeze and thaw cycle in the soils. This was a silty clay soil. So our biggest question was, do we have the infiltration rates we need to get that water into the soil and not saturate and kill the plants? Kurt mentioned how sandy his soils were. Ours are more clayey. Another example of a very aesthetic rain garden. Lots of good plant selection there. You can see the pink flowers are those plastic flag flowers that we put in during our research project. Here's a very interesting one. A lot of additional features the homeowner put in to accentuate this garden. You can see the mass plantings. Up above is our research equipment, which I'll talk about here in a few minutes as well. This one, you can clearly discern the outer berm around the outside of the garden there. And that's how these were all were constructed in a similar manner by the same landscape company. Here's an example, which one my colleague Steve Rohde detests. It's a small little dot out on the landscape. He wants these integrated with the other landscape, and this wouldn't have been too hard to do here. But it gives you just a clear example of the type of garden we're talking about in this study. Okay, I want to briefly discuss how we did the study. We used a storm runoff simulator. This is a device we've been developing at Nebraska for the last 10 years. It's a mobile device to go out and do field assessment on research plots or in settings like this to evaluate rain gardens or other hydrologic features in the landscape. We've created this to be portable so that it can replicate a design storm. Normally we talk about 1 inch of rain falling. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that's a volume, but now you know we have a hydrograph effect when we have a real rainstorm, especially a short duration storm. So we've designed this machine to be able to output water at a designed discharge rate to reach a peak flow. Maximum peak flow we've designed for is 140 gallons per minute. And this is about a 10-year design storm in our area. Here are some features of the runoff simulator. The red device is the gate valve, V-port gate valve, which is controllable through electronic signals to open and close at any position we want to get the discharge rate that we desire. The aqua-colored device in there is a magnetic flow meter that senses the actual discharge through the pipe. So that was for our monitoring and research purposes. And then we're able to get feedback off of that measurement and change our valve opening should we need to. But typically the valve opening could be calibrated in the lab and then not in the lab, but in the field, calibrate it, and then open and close to get the desired discharge rate based on our system's pressure. That pressure was created by this pump here, which was integrated into the water piping and the water supply. So that pressure then against that valve is monitored, and we calibrate the valve to discharge the rate we want. Here's the brains of the system, a computer program written to send that signal to the computer. We would then take our design runoff, or pardon me, design rainfall depth. Kurt's was 1 inch, ours was 1.2 inches. We took the drainage area, but then instead of just calculating a volume of runoff, we'd calculate a discharge and a hydrograph. And then we'd program that valve to open and close to discharge that peak hydrograph. And we saw pictures of those hydrographs earlier, what Kurt showed us. So here's the device in the field. We're doing one of our rain garden studies. The white and the pipe in the foreground here is the discharge outlet. You can see the red valve, the marine meter, and then the long hose bringing the water from our trailer-mounted tank. Here's what the tank looks like. It's about a 500-gallon cone-bottom tank. We also have the ability to, we'll need the ability to refill this tank. If you use more than 500 gallons of water, you need to keep refilling this. So we were able to tap into Lincoln City fire hydrants to do that. This particular system is a prototype of the design, and it's actually a half-scale size. So our full design would have 2 500-gallon tanks or else a 1,000-gallon tank for the design storms we're targeting. And here it is being used at one of our rain garden sites. We can tow this around the city, go to all the different sites, park at street side, and then run our piping to our rain gardens. So that's what we used to do our hydrology study. So just to summarize one more time, we did hydrologic evaluation of residential rain gardens that had no underdrains. They were all natural inflow based, trying to simulate Midwest climate and soil types. Our questions were, what is the holding capacity of the rain gardens we see, and what is the drain time, which really is how well do they infiltrate. That was our main question. We coupled this with a plant study. We knew the planting pattern, the plant design that was done on all these rain gardens by the landscaping firm, so we could study the plants that existed then 4 years later. What was the survivability? Were they replanted? How was the garden growing, so to speak? And I'll report a little bit on both of these. This was part of, as I mentioned, a pilot study in the city of Lincoln. Each triangle on this map shows where one of our study rain gardens was located, all within the Holmes Lake watershed, similar soil types throughout. The green button is a weather station up there. There's one site that was outside the watershed. We couldn't find enough sites acceptable within our watershed, so we found one just outside with similar soil characteristics. So summarizing the characteristics of the gardens we studied, we looked at 12 of the gardens for the hydrology factors. We looked at 16 to evaluate the plant life and plant assessment. The average rain garden size was 100 square feet. If you recall, Kurt's was 400, I believe. But his are street side, accepting street-wide runoff, much greater volumes anticipated. These were in yards, accepting runoff from roofs. The garden catchment ratio was between 6 and 25%. And as I mentioned, our silty clay and clay soils were of concern with 36% clay. After amending these, the top 6 inches, then the clay percentage went down to 23%. So that means there's more organic material in there from our amendments. And that was beneficial. We did that primarily to improve plant growth. A lot of these clays aren't the best for plant growth because some of these sites were where the topsoil was taken off. So the soil that remains is that subsoil. It'll grow sod if you keep fertilizing it forever, but we want to grow native plants, so that was the purpose of the compost. So summarizing what we found with hydrology, the volume storage capacity was generally undersized for all of these rain gardens that we studied. I mentioned the 1.2 inch volume storm that we used as our design model. Only 2 of the gardens were able to hold that amount of water. Now, I have to say a caveat, and it goes back to what Kurt said, you got to please the homeowner. Not all of these gardens were built to the proper size because homeowners didn't want that big of a garden in their yard. This was a pilot study, so we had that balance. But we wanted to test their effectiveness for at the design standard. Improper grading of the berm and overflow was common. A lot of these rain gardens were not built level in the bottom with side slopes to create a bathtub effect. They were built more like a bowl effect, okay? So you can't hold as much. Some of them are even built on a slope with a grade in the bottom, so water would flow to one end and over top rather than be held inside the basin. Infiltration rates did not appear to limit our performance. We had very high infiltration rates. As I mentioned, the several years of growth, root growth, freeze-thaw, created some good infiltration rates in our soils. All of our drainage times were less than our design max of 48 hours. We had floating mulch problems in a lot of our studies. Some of this could have been because we were 4 and 5 years post-installation. Homeowners may have replaced mulch that had decomposed over time and may have put the wrong mulch in there that tended to float more than maintain itself. I'll show you some of the data here. The bioretention guidelines, we wanted to store the water quality volume, that 1.2 inches. The general failure to do that was seen throughout the study. On average, we held 40% of that water quality volume in our rain gardens. And a lot of that storage, even so, was in the soil through infiltration, not really storage above ground. So we really are undersized in design. Here's a graph showing our rain garden storage on the y-axis. That's just pending overflow. That means we filled the rain garden up just to the very top before it would start to overflow the berm. And on the x-axis is the design storm volume that should be held. The solid line is the 1-to-1 ratio. So we have 2 gardens there that pretty much captured their design storm. The dashed line is the 1/2 or 2-to-1 ratio. So most of the other gardens, all the other gardens, held less than half of what they could have been designed for if they were targeting the design storm. This graph shows with the bars the distribution of that storage. The surface storage is shown in the yellowish or pumpkin colored part of the bar. The sage colored part of the bar is the water that was infiltrated. As you know, with our runoff simulator, we were able to measure the amount of water we put on, so we knew the exact volume that we put on. We were also able to measure the volume held on the surface in each garden, because we surveyed each garden, so once it's full, we had a maximum of volume storage. The difference then is what infiltrated over the time of the study, runoff period. So a majority of our water was infiltrated, even in the rain gardens that held their water quality volume. So the bad news is they're all undersized, but the good news is infiltration was quite good. We were able to get that water into the soil. The drainage times are shown here. All were less than the 48-hour. 24 to 48 hours is sometimes given as the criteria you want to get that drainage done in for maintain your plant health. So here are 2 different colored bars. The design storm is the first storm we put in. When we filled it right up to the top of the berm, as I mentioned, pending overflow. And then we have an overflow storm where we just put the water to it. You know, we got the 4-inch rainfall. What happens when it starts to flow out and overflow the berm? And that was what that storm was for. In either case, we had drainage in less than 48 hours. How much time do I have left, Alex?
You got 20 minutes, a little less than 20 minutes.
Oh, plenty of time. Okay. So let me stop there with any questions, because I'm going to transition into the plant assessment portion here if they have a quick question. We can come back again later for questions, because I'll summarize at the end. Okay, so the plant assessment was a visual inspection of the rain gardens from the street view. We looked at 16 of the 18 trial rain gardens that we had. We did somewhat of a hydrologic impression as well. Was it functioning? Was it holding water? Did it look like it had inlet or outlet problems? Was there any erosion problems? The vegetation assessment looked at survivability. As I mentioned, we knew the planting design that was put in initially, so we could assess what remained 4 years later. And then the general appearance and health of those plants. We also assessed other site condition factors like the lawn irrigation, what was the shade effect on the garden itself, and anything else we could see there. So summarizing these points, there were many healthy plants as expected. We were glad to see that. Generally, we found plants in bloom in the seasons we went to visit these sites. So plants were growing and growing healthfully. Adjacent sprinkler irrigation became a problem. There were some negative impacts of excess water because they just let their sprinklers run irregardless, and too much water got on some of these plants, and the native plants didn't appreciate that, didn't grow too well. Shade impacts were underestimated. A lot of plants were put in shady areas that were not shade tolerant, and they just didn't survive. So it's one of the definitely one of the lessons learned, is that the landscaper has to know, landscape architect, get them involved, which plants can survive in the shaded conditions of the garden. We found out we needed more diversity. Much more native plant species would be recommended. We had some, but we also, as mentioned, tried to please the homeowner and gave them some choices on what plants they wanted. Plant placement was a big issue too, getting plants that can handle that damp soil in the bottom of the basin where it's moisture and survive versus a plant that can't survive under wet roots. And sometimes there was some overcrowding that occurred. Overmulching, as I mentioned, was a problem. Sometimes they buried plants with too much mulch, and I think I mentioned the floating mulch issue we also found out later. So one thing we found was that bottom vegetation was sparser than ideal. Bottom meaning the basin of the garden versus the side slopes in berm. So that's what I mean by bottom, is down low where the water ponds. In a lot of cases was sparser than ideal. So here's a fun graphic. Our watershed is outlined there, and we show each circle represents one rain garden, and this is a survival rating by species. So if it's green, that means all species survived in that rain garden. If it's yellow, that means there was partial survival by a particular species, and red means none of that species survived. So you can see in general, by just looking at these pie graphs, we have pretty good survival. Looks like around 75% on average. There are some key bad boys. Site number 1 and number 19. Number 1 had over 50% of failure. Number 7, over 50% if you count partial and none. Number 19. But overall, we didn't feel too bad about this. It's interesting that in a lot of the cases, you can see it's green or it's red. So we either had the plants that survived, or the wrong plant was put in the wrong place and it disappeared. So here is a graphic or a table that shows some of the particular plants that were used in these gardens. The second column is the number of gardens that they were planted in. So we had 18 gardens, if you remember. We only were able to evaluate 16 of those, but then we have a column for full survival. If that plant species survived fully, how many gardens it survived in. Some survival, the number of gardens, and then no survival. So you kind of see that same ratio that we saw in that other graphic. The letters represent whether that plant was put on the top side or bottom of the garden. Remember I mentioned the bottom is the level area where it's damper. The top is and then the top of the berm or the side of the berm. So we distinguish that. And that just gives you some idea of the types of species we had. My colleague Steve Rohde was the landscape horticulturalist who did this part of the study. And for those of you who have a deep interest in this part of the study, at least in what followed on, Steve has printed this Bioretention and Rain Garden Plants Guide. I've got a couple copies here I'd be willing to share with those who are interested. It's not the report of this study, but it's the report of the recommended plants that we now recommend based on the results of some of this study. Just to complete that list for you, the types of species that were put out there, and again, the survival, full survival versus partial. So there wasn't, there was success in the plantings, but we were able to isolate those few areas, one being the shade, killed a lot of plants. Putting a species that can't have wet roots in the bottom of a basin was another big reason. So let me summarize then. For plants, from the perspective of the plants, appropriately sloped and planted berms are what we need, what was successful. long-term and initial maintenance as far as weeding and mulching and watering. Overwatering can be as bad as underwatering. Appropriately selected native and adapted species were had better survival. And then, as I mentioned, bottom side and berm placement to the appropriate location is also critical. We also evaluated the overflow structures of these rain gardens. I mentioned that there is an inlet. We have a targeted inlet from the downspout, and then we also were intending to design an outlet. So when it fills up and overflows, the water should flow out an outlet like the one shown here where it's rock covered to prevent erosion as that water flows away. So when we did that overflow storm I mentioned where we put on 3 inches of rain, we wanted to watch where the water went out of the rain garden. But most of these outflow structures were poorly done, poorly placed and poorly designed. The berms weren't level. Some of them remained dry during an overflow event. Water didn't even flow on them. The grading was poor. In some cases there wasn't an overflow structure. In some places they retrofit one after the fact and didn't do it very well. So overall, that's an area that the design of these things needs to improve, or the design and construction needs to improve. So here's a few pictures. You can see this particular photograph. Up in the upper right corner you can see the turf is eroded away. You can see evidence of mulch flowing. And this isn't even at the outlet structure. This is, you can see the corner, the top left corner of this picture is a little bit of rock there. That's where the outlet structure was designed for. So it flowed through the wrong area. Here's another example of water just pouring off of the berm. You can see the water sheen there. There's no outlet structure there. It's just another location on the berm. Finally, you can see this particular one. Underneath that mulch is some rock. You can see that is the outlet structure, but there's erosion occurring, water's on soil, and mulch is overflowing the garden. So these were examples of the failure of these structures. Okay, so summarizing the findings on the rain gardens, the volume storage capacity was generally undersized compared to our water quality volume storm. That was due to improper grading of the berm, and overflow was common because there was low spots in the berm, not at the outlet structure. We didn't have any catastrophic failures. We didn't give it the 100-year storm or anything like that. Infiltration rate does not appear to limit performance. They were quite high in our study. We were able to infiltrate that water rapidly. Runoff conveyance is inefficient for rain gardens disconnected from the downspout. So the picture I showed initially showed a downspout very near the rain garden, 10, 12 feet away. Some of these gardens were placed further down on the lawn, near to the sidewalk or the street, so the conveyance distance from that downspout was longer. Generally, those did not work in the settings we had. So you definitely need a better, definite connection between your downspout and your garden to get that water there. Floating mulch, as I've mentioned a couple times. Here's a couple poor examples of poor performance. You can see this is our outlet structure. There's a well-built stone-covered weir there. Well, here's where the water's flowing out, eroding the bank and eroding the berm and washing the mulch out. Here's an example you can see in the top of the picture is our inlet device from our runoff simulator, and water's flowing in. On the right half of the picture you can see the wet mulch and the heavy green grass growing. On the left side it's dry. So the slope of the garden went one direction, so the water would enter in this left half of the garden never got wet, never held water at all. So a poorly graded rain garden installation. And finally, here's an example of that massive mulch flotilla. You can see our staff gauge out there in the middle. The water is about 3/10 of a foot deep. All this mulch is floating away. The yellow flags represent the outline of the berm. So just to show up, what we then did was take this data, take this study, and make better recommendations for our future rain garden installations. So we recommend to amend the top 6 inches of clay with some compost so we get good plant growth. It really increases infiltration. increase the design area to match that water quality volume. And we've written a new design NEB guide, online NEB guide that actually walks homeowners through that process. You got to get those bottom of those gardens level to get that maximum holding capacity. And then the berms have to be level so that the water will outflow at the outflow structure versus somewhere else. Create that outflow slightly lower than the elevation of the berm so we actually get the water going through that outflow, and then use shredded mulch instead of chip mulch so we don't have that floating problem. So I'll open it up for questions. If you want to contact me, of course I'm in the booklet for this symposium, but here's my email address. And,
Did all of your gardens have trees?
did all of our gardens have trees? We didn't have trees in any of the gardens. The shading was from trees near the garden that were part of that same yard or our neighbor's yard or something. Yes?
Were the berms being constructed with like lower filtration in the soils, or were they more like have a barrier that allowed water to stay in the cell long enough to infiltrate?
Okay. He asked if the berms were constructed from low infiltration material. The berms were constructed from the soil that was on the site. They just scraped the soil to dig down, and then they packed that soil on the berm. And so it would have been a silty clay soil. And then they compacted it so it would have been less permeable. So it shouldn't cause any loss of water that way. Yeah.
I was just curious on your method for incorporating the compost. How did you do that to amend the soil?
That was tilled in with just a garden tiller type of device.
And your source of compost?
Lindgrow, which is a Lincoln municipal-based compost that they make, the city makes. They collect all the city's vegetation, leaves, cuttings, and everything, and they compost that annually, and they create a compost that they sell. So we use the city's supply of compost.